Good afternoon, everyone. Had a bit of a technical glitch, but I think we are back on track now. Welcome to day 4 of our second week of our leadership study. Today, we continue on with our study of Joshua and the law of influence. And we're delighted to have you all with us, whether you're here live in the chapel or remoting in, or whether you might see this later. But anyway, welcome, and let's just jump right in. So, the law of influence, which we have talked about many times, simply says the true measure of leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. We've mentioned that all week long, and so we don't need to elaborate on that now. We will proceed with our leadership thought for the day. And this goes in a little different direction because we're going to be talking about family and the fact that when a leader places family first, future generations will be blessed. One of the things that we will look at a little bit later is the life of a revivalist preacher in the 18th century by the name of Jonathan Edwards. And we're going to just take a moment a little bit later in our time today to examine Jonathan Edwards' legacy in terms of his descendants and the various roles that they ended up playing. It's a very fascinating study of the legacy of Jonathan Edwards. But right now, we want to go back to Joshua and look at Joshua's final stand. And what I mean by that is his last declaration, his last public address before his own passing, very much like Moses. Welcome. Very much like Moses in terms of giving a charge to the people of Israel to live for the Lord and to dedicate their lives to the Lord. Now, this passage has a special meaning for my wife and I, because this was our theme verse for our wedding back in 1987. And you probably will recognize this, probably the one verse that's most associated with Joshua in chapter 24 and verse 15, which says, "And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell." Now here's the line that everyone's most familiar with as it relates to Joshua. "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Well, what an inspiration, Joshua being the national leader, to set that kind of example, where basically he says, you do what you're going to do, but he laid his marker down and said, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what my house is going to do. And so we want to focus our time today on the importance of family. Because really at the end of the day, if we kind of conquer the world in terms of our leadership journey, but leave our family out of it, is it really worth it? And so with that, let's share this thought from John Maxwell. He says on page 29 of the book, 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day, as a leader, where should your influence begin? A good answer can be drawn from the life of Joshua. For him, as for other leaders wanting to make an impact beyond their lifetimes, it began at home. Before anything else, Joshua took responsibility for the spiritual life of his family. So important to start small and build out. That's what we're talking about. And so let's take a look at Joshua's leadership values for just a few moments. A couple of things, and then we'll have some comments about each one of those. First, Joshua's leadership of his family was greater than his leadership of the nation. I'll share that again. Joshua's leadership of his family was greater than his leadership of the nation. Secondly, boy, isn't this so very important. Regardless of what others did, Joshua didn't wait for the crowd. And then finally, Joshua modeled faith-filled leadership as a parent. So let's dive into these three values just a little bit deeper. I like this statement in John Maxwell's book, and he talks about the relationship of family and community. So listen carefully where he says, when a leader puts his family first, the community benefits. When a leader puts the community first, both his family and, surprisingly, the community suffer. So Joshua gained credibility to lead the entire household of Israel because he had his priorities right and because he led his household well. Does that make sense? If a person has challenges at home and providing a good model in their private life, should we really expect them to live appropriately or to assume a leadership role publicly? There's a correlation there. That's what we're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be perfect, because nobody is. Certainly, we want to keep that in mind. But generally speaking, we want someone's private life to be the basis on which to entrust them in public life. So, moving on, regardless of what others did, Joshua didn't wait for the crowd. Joshua, throughout his lifetime, draws lines in the sand. Regardless of what anyone else decided, what they did, Joshua determined to lead his family in serving the Lord. As we looked yesterday and talked about for a little bit, Joshua did not engage in what we today call go along to get along, go with the flow. He didn't do it at the beginning of his career. He didn't do it in the middle of his career. He didn't do it at the end of his career. Thus, he displayed consistent integrity, which earned the respect of his followers. So, looking at his life, we remember that he, along with Caleb, stood against the other 10 spies, and then ultimately the entire nation who wanted to stone them, select another leader, and go back to Egypt. But Joshua and Caleb took their stands and said, nope, we're trusting God. He gave us this land. He promised it to us. We should go forward because we can most certainly do it. Isn't that the kind of leadership that you would want to follow? Someone who's not wishy-washy, someone who's not here today, gone tomorrow, in one day, out the next day, but whose interior life is marked with integrity. What a model, both for us to aspire to, but also to follow. And then, kind of going along with this, Joshua modeled faith-filled leadership as a parent. We talked yesterday about his life of prayer and faith and obedience. That's a good foundation right there. All three of those things. Spiritual leadership at home promotes family health. Does it guarantee it? No, because everyone has a free will and can go on their own. I've known many godly parents whose children did not choose to go in their path. Sometimes that happens. But I would say for every time that happens, far more often, if there's a good example set at home, the children will follow. Not guaranteed, but it does set a foundation. And so that's why spiritual leadership at home promotes family health. Maybe this would be a good time for you to reflect on this. Did you have the benefit of an effective spiritual leadership modeled for you when you were growing up? If you're wondering about that, thinking about that, I'll share on the next slide some examples. Maybe they were present, maybe they weren't present. And these are things that we can aspire to as we perhaps are leading our own homes. So let me mention just a few of these examples of spiritual leadership at home. First, at least first in my mind, is prayer. earnest and often. Not just, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep right before bed, or thank you, Lord, for this food. But beyond that, secondly, talking openly about the things of God. How is God in your life? How are you and God doing? Just having discussions. That doesn't have to be 24/7 either. There's time and place to watch the football game or their favorite show, or to just have fun times together. We all understand that. But that where God is not a stranger in the house. Thirdly, sharing your faith with others. Again, we're not talking about bombarding people with it, but when they come up to you and say, why do you seem together, or why do you seem to have a smile on your face all the time, or why do you seem to be optimistic? You share, with the help of God, that is a big part of it. Next, putting God first in finances, being generous with people, being generous with your finances. Ministry to marginalized and underserved people. Do we care about the needs of people who are unmet? And what can we do to be a part of that? Here's this next one. How important is this? Speaking positively about other people. Imagine being in a home where the only talk about other people, probably not in the home, but maybe people who are, is always negative. What example does that set? And how likely do you think it would be for children to turn out to be positive people? Something tells me there'd be a strong orientation for children who were raised in that environment to become like that themselves. Is it automatic? No. They could certainly, with training and with a great determination, actively rebel against that and become more positive, but the inclination would certainly be toward negativity. How about this? A deep love and commitment to one's spouse. Marriage is important. The people in your house, and I would certainly add children in there too. And kind of going back to the top and closing the loop, an intimate relationship with God. Now, these are not meant to be an exhaustive list. These are just some examples. You can come up with others, but here's just a prime to pump, so to speak, to think about actual ways of living out spiritual leadership at home. Now, earlier this afternoon, I mentioned Jonathan Edwards. You may or may not have heard of him. Jonathan Edwards was an 18th century revivalist preacher, philosopher, and theologian. He probably did pretty well in school, I would think. Very smart. But what I want to share, and when I came across this, it really it impacted me greatly. And listen to his legacy. In other words, what did his children and grandchildren become? From his lineage, Jonathan Edwards, 13 college presidents, 65 college professors, 100 lawyers, including the dean of a law school, 30 judges, 66 physicians, including the dean of a medical school, 80 holders of public office, including 3 U.S. senators, 3 mayors of large cities, 3 governors, a U.S. vice president, and a controller of the U.S. Treasury. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty awesome legacy to leave behind. And we're not talking about just that, these are pretty high visibility positions that they held, but just that they had the character quality and the training and the skills and the desires to get the education and to get the training. What that says about Jonathan Edwards and his wife is very powerful. And so wouldn't it be great, not that we measure ourselves by that standard, but that the example that we set in our homes is that our kids can be what God has created them to be, whatever that is. They don't have to be a college professor or a president or anything like that. Just be who they are and who God created them to be. So in conclusion today, if you want to impact your community, your country, or your world, guess where the place to start is? 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. It's in your home. It's in your home. So today's question for reflection: are you truly placing your family first? So again, just think about it. Don't beat yourself up over it. That's not the point. Just give it some thought. And maybe there's some things that, as we've talked about today, can instigate some thinking and some reflection for you. So with that, we look forward to sharing day 5 tomorrow, kind of wrapping things up, reviewing this week, and charting ahead next week. We'll be looking at the life of Joseph next week. And so don't want to get ahead of ourselves, though. God bless you. Thank you all for being a part of this. And it's a joy to share this experience with you. We'll see you tomorrow at 1:30, remember, on Fridays, not 3:30. And we'll look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.